The old community hall smelled of dust and forgotten dreams. Wooden chairs creaked as people settled in, their quiet chatter filling the room with a gentle hum. In the back corner, half hidden by a worn velvet curtain, stood Thomas Lee, a man who once made grand pianos sing but now only listened as others tried. Thomas pulled at his collar, uncomfortable in the formal shirt he rarely wore these days. His eyes darted around the room, taking in the handmade posters announcing the fundraiser, the hopeful faces of parents who had brought their children to see what the local arts program could offer. 5 years ago, he would have been the star attraction. Now he was just another face in the crowd, and that's exactly how he wanted it. "I didn't think you'd actually come," a warm voice said beside him. Thomas turned to find Mrs. Chen, his former teacher, smiling up at him. At 72, she stood barely 5 feet tall, but her presence filled any room she entered. Her silver hair was pulled back in the same tight bun she'd worn for the 30 years she'd taught piano at the local college. "You didn't leave me much choice," Thomas replied, but there was no real annoyance in his voice. "You called 6 times in 3 days. Mrs. Chen laughed, the sound like bells. "And you ignored the first 5 calls. I'm just glad you're here." Her expression softened. "It's been too long, Thomas." He nodded, not trusting himself to speak. It had been nearly 5 years since he'd set foot in any place that reminded him of his old life. 5 years since the accident that had crushed 3 fingers on his left hand and ended his promising career as a concert pianist before it had truly begun. Mrs. Chen touched his arm gently. "I'm not asking for anything big. Just a few minutes of your time. The kids need to see someone demonstrate proper hand position, basic scales, simple notes, that's all." Thomas flexed his left hand unconsciously. The doctors had done their best. Physical therapy had restored movement, but the fingers would never be the same. The once fluid motion now had a stiffness to it, a hesitation that made playing at his former level impossible, or so he'd convinced himself. "I'm not the right person for this," he said quietly. "You're exactly the right person," Mrs. Chen insisted. "These kids don't need perfection. They need inspiration. They need to see someone who understands what music really means." Thomas looked around the hall again. A boy of about 9 was thumbing through sheet music with careful attention. A teenage girl sat alone, headphones on, fingers tapping out rhythms on her knees. They reminded him of himself once upon a time. "I work at a music store now," he said, as if that explained everything. "I sell instruments. I don't play them." Mrs. Chen's eyebrows rose. "So you left the stage to sell pianos to other people? That's like a chef who stops cooking to sell pots and pans." Thomas smiled despite himself. Mrs. Chen had always had a way with words. Blunt, sometimes painfully so, but always honest. "It pays the bills," he said, "and does it feed your soul?" she asked. He didn't answer. They both knew it didn't. The lights dimmed slightly, signaling the program was about to begin. Thomas took a seat in the back row, hoping to remain unnoticed. Mrs. Chen moved to the front of the room, her small frame somehow commanding attention without effort. "Welcome, everyone, to our annual spring showcase and fundraiser," she began. "Tonight you'll see what our students have been working on, and why our community arts program deserves your support." Thomas watched as, one by one, students of various ages took to the small stage. Some played with confidence, others with nervous energy that made their performances endearing if not technically perfect. A young boy stumbled through a simplified version of Für Elise, his tongue caught between his teeth in concentration. When he finished, the audience applauded warmly and his proud smile lit up the room. As he watched, Thomas felt something stir inside him. He remembered his own first recital, the terror and exhilaration of performing for an audience. The way his heart had pounded so loudly he'd been sure everyone could hear it. And later, the rush of accomplishment that came with mastering a difficult piece, of creating something beautiful from nothing but notes on a page and the skill in his hands. After an hour of performances, Mrs. Chen returned to the microphone. "And now we have a special demonstration planned. Professor Wilson was going to show us some techniques on proper hand positioning and basic exercises. But unfortunately, his wife went into labor this afternoon." A murmur went through the crowd, followed by a smattering of applause for the absent professor's good news. "However," Mrs. Chen continued, her eyes finding Thomas in the back row, "we are fortunate to have with us tonight a former student of mine who can step in." Thomas felt his stomach drop. This wasn't what he had agreed to. He had come to watch, maybe speak to a few students afterward, not to perform. Mrs. Chen was still speaking. Thomas Lee studied with me for 10 years before being accepted to the National Conservatory. Some of you might remember the articles about him in the local paper. People were turning in their seats now, looking for him. Thomas sank lower, wishing he could disappear. Thomas, would you please come up and show our students the importance of proper technique? Just a few simple notes, Mrs. Chen said, her eyes twinkling with mischief. She knew exactly what she was doing. For a moment, Thomas considered walking out. His hand throbbed with phantom pain, a psychosomatic reminder of why he no longer played. But something kept him rooted to his seat. Perhaps it was the hopeful faces of the students, or maybe it was the challenge in Mrs. Chen's eyes. Slowly he stood. The room seemed to stretch before him, the distance to the piano at the front impossibly far. Each step felt heavy, as if his shoes were filled with concrete. Whispers followed him as he made his way forward. Is that really him? I heard he was amazing before the accident. My cousin saw him play with the symphony once. The old grand piano waited for him, its black surface gleaming under the lights. It wasn't a concert Steinway like the ones he'd played in his brief professional career, but a well-loved instrument that had seen decades of use. Thomas ran his fingers lightly over the fallboard, feeling the smooth wood beneath his fingertips. Mrs. Chen stepped aside, giving him the floor. Thomas will demonstrate some basic exercises that form the foundation of piano technique, she announced to the audience. Thomas sat down on the bench, adjusting it out of habit. The keys lay before him, white and black, familiar yet somehow foreign after so long. He placed his hands in his lap, aware that everyone was watching. Waiting, the most important thing for beginners, he began, his voice rough from disuse, his proper hand position. He lifted his right hand first, curving his fingers into the shape piano. Teachers had been demonstrating for centuries. Your hand should form a dome, as if you're holding a small ball. Not too flat, not too curved. His left hand remained in his lap, hidden from view. Someone in the audience coughed. A child whispered a question to their parent. Scales are the building blocks of music, Thomas continued. They teach finger strength, coordination, and help you learn key signatures. Still, he didn't touch the keys. His heart hammered in his chest. What was he doing here? He wasn't a teacher. He wasn't even a pianist anymore. Mrs. Chen moved closer, her voice low so only he could hear. Play, Thomas. Just simple notes. That's all I'm asking. He looked up at her, this tiny woman who had shaped his musical life from the age of 7, who had believed in him when his own parents had suggested more practical pursuits, who had cried with joy when he'd been accepted to the conservatory, and cried with sorrow when the accident had derailed everything they'd worked for. I can't, he whispered. You can, she insisted. Not for me. Not for them. For yourself. Thomas took a deep breath. Then slowly he lifted both hands and placed them on the keys. The ivory felt cool beneath his fingertips. Familiar. Right. His right hand moved easily into a C major scale, the most basic of all. 8 notes up, 8 notes down, simple, clean, perfect. Then with hesitation his left hand joined in. The damaged fingers moved more slowly, more deliberately. There was stiffness where once there had been fluid motion, but the notes came. One after another. Not perfect, but present. The simple exercise complete, Thomas let his hands rest on the keys. The room was silent. He hadn't realized he'd closed his eyes until he opened them to find everyone watching him with expectation. That's the basic C major scale, he said, suddenly self-conscious. Nothing special, but it's where everyone begins. A young girl in the front row raised her hand. Can you play something real? She asked, her eyes wide with curiosity. Before he could answer, Mrs. Chen stepped in. Thomas is just here to demonstrate techniques today. Perhaps another time he'll... No, it's okay, Thomas heard himself say. I can play a little something. The words surprised him as much as anyone. It had been so long since he'd wanted to play anything at all. He positioned his hands again, thinking. What could he play that wouldn't demand too much from his damaged left hand? Something simple yet beautiful. Something to remind himself why he had once loved this instrument more than anything in the world. His fingers hovered over the keys as the audience waited, the air thick with anticipation. No one breathed. No one moved. And then, Thomas began to play. Thomas's fingers touched the keys gently, like greeting an old friend he hadn't seen in years. He began with a simple melody, one of the first pieces Mrs. Chen had taught him as a child. The notes hung in the air, clean and pure, filling the small community hall with sound. Nothing fancy, nothing complicated. Just honest music. As he played, something strange happened. The stiffness in his left hand seemed less noticeable. His damaged fingers found their places almost by memory, moving from one note to the next with a fluidity he hadn't felt in years. It wasn't perfect, he could feel the hesitation, the slight clumsiness where once there had been only grace, but it was music. Real music. He finished the short piece and lifted his hands from the keys. The silence that followed felt heavy, like the moment before a summer storm breaks. Then came the applause, enthusiastic, genuine, warm. Thomas looked up, surprised. He had forgotten there was an audience. For those brief moments, it had been just him and the piano, reconnecting after a long separation. Mrs. Chen beamed at him, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "Thank you, Thomas," she said into the microphone. That was a perfect demonstration of how even simple notes, when played with feeling, can create something beautiful. Thomas nodded, eager to return to his seat in the shadows. He had done what she asked, played a few simple notes. That was enough for one day. More than enough. But as he stood to leave the stage, the back door of the hall opened. A tall, elegant woman in a dark blue dress hurried in, followed by a harried-looking man carrying a folder stuffed with papers. They slipped into seats at the back, but not before Thomas recognized her. Victoria Wu, the renowned director of the State Symphony Orchestra. Mrs. Chen noticed them too. Her eyes widened slightly, but she continued smoothly. "And now we'll hear from our advanced student group, who have prepared a selection from Mozart." Thomas made his way back to his seat, hyper-aware of Victoria Wu's presence. What was she doing at a small community fundraiser? He kept his head down, hoping she wouldn't notice him. Their paths had crossed briefly years ago, when he was still a promising young talent and she was beginning her meteoric rise in the classical music world. 4 teenage students took the stage, arranging themselves around a second piano and with various instruments. They played well, if not perfectly, their young faces intense with concentration. When they finished, the applause was enthusiastic. Mrs. Chen returned to the microphone. "Thank you all for coming tonight. Your support means everything to our program. Please enjoy some refreshments in the lobby, and feel free to speak with our students and teachers about our work." People began to stand, stretching and chatting as they moved toward the lobby where punch and cookies waited. Thomas remained seated, planning to slip out once the crowd thinned. But before he could make his escape, Mrs. Chen was beside him again, and she wasn't alone. "Thomas, you remember Victoria Wu," she said, her tone making it clear this was not a coincidence. "Victoria, this is Thomas Lee, my former student I was telling you about." Victoria Wu extended her hand, her grip firm and professional. "Of course. We met briefly at the Young Artists competition in Denver. You played Rachmaninoff, if I remember correctly. Brilliantly." Thomas shook her hand, uncomfortable with the reminder of his past life. "That was a long time ago," he said. "Not so long," Victoria replied, studying him with keen interest. 6 years, 7? 5 years and 4 months, Thomas said before he could stop himself. She nodded as if confirming something. "Mrs. Chen mentioned your accident. I was sorry to hear about it." Thomas shot his former teacher a look. So this had been planned. He should have known Mrs. Chen never did anything without multiple layers of purpose. "It's fine," he said stiffly. "I've moved on." Victoria looked at the piano, then back at him. "Have you? Because what I just heard suggests otherwise." Thomas didn't know how to respond. The truth was he hadn't moved on at all. He'd simply stopped. Stopped playing, stopped trying, stopped believing he had anything to offer the world of music. "Look," Victoria said, cutting through his thoughts. "I'll be direct. We have a situation. Our pianist for tomorrow night's fundraiser gala has the flu. High fever, can't even sit up. We need a replacement." Thomas blinked, not understanding at first. Then it dawned on him what she was suggesting. "No," he said immediately. "Absolutely not. You wouldn't be playing a full concerto?" Victoria continued as if he hadn't spoken. "Just a 15-minute set during the cocktail hour. Simple pieces, background music really." "I don't perform anymore," Thomas said firmly. "I can't." Victoria raised an eyebrow. "Can't? Or won't? Because what I just heard suggests you very much can." What you heard was a children's piece that any second-year student could play, Thomas argued. What I heard, Victoria countered, was musicality, feeling. The technical aspects can be worked around. You have something many technically perfect pianists lack, the ability to make people feel something. Mrs. Chen, who had been silent during this exchange, finally spoke up. The program tomorrow night is raising money for music education in underserved schools. The same kind of program that gave you your start, Thomas. It was a low blow and they all knew it. Thomas had grown up in a neighborhood where dreams of becoming a concert pianist were considered impossible fantasies. If not for a similar community program that had provided lessons and access to instruments, he would never have discovered his talent. This isn't fair, he said quietly. Life rarely is, Victoria replied with a small smile, but sometimes it offers second chances. The question is whether we're brave enough to take them. Thomas looked at his left hand, at the scars that ran across his knuckles and the slightly crooked set of his ring finger. I haven't practiced in years. I don't have anything prepared. Play what you just played, Victoria suggested, and perhaps a few other pieces from your early repertoire. Nothing technically demanding, just beautiful. The hall had emptied now, just the three of them standing in the dim light. Through the doors, Thomas could hear the cheerful noise of the reception, parents and students celebrating the night's performances. I don't even have proper clothes, he said, grasping at excuses. A pianist needs a suit for a gala. Victoria smiled. David, my assistant, is about your size. He always brings an extra suit to events in case of spills. I'm sure he'd be happy to lend it to you. Thomas looked from Mrs. Chen to Victoria, feeling cornered. Why me? Surely there are dozens of pianists in the city who would jump at this chance. Because Mrs. Chen called me this afternoon and played me a recording of you from before your accident, Victoria said simply, and I want that musician, that artist, at my event. Thomas turned to Mrs. Chen in surprise. You still have recordings of me? The older woman nodded. Of course I do. All my special students. I keep everything. Thomas felt something shift inside him like ice breaking on a frozen river. The thought that his music, his old self, had been preserved somewhere all this time was strangely moving. The gala starts at 7, Victoria said, sensing his resolve weakening. Cocktail hour begins at 6. We'd need you there by 5 for a sound check. She pulled a business card from her purse and held it out. Call this number if you decide to do it. But please let me know by 9 tonight so I can make other arrangements if necessary. Thomas took the card automatically, staring at the embossed lettering. Victoria Wu, Artistic Director, State Symphony Orchestra. Think about it, Mrs. Chen urged gently. Just simple notes, Thomas. That's all anyone is asking for. They left him then, standing alone in the empty hall. Thomas walked slowly back to the piano and sat down on the bench. The keys seemed to wait expectantly, patient after years of his absence. He placed his hands on them again, not playing, just feeling their cool smoothness beneath his fingers. 5 years ago, he had been on the verge of everything he'd ever dreamed of. A recording contract, concert tours, recognition. Then had come the accident. Black ice on a winter night, a skidding car. His instinctive move to protect his face that had left his hand to take the brunt of the impact as he was thrown against the dashboard. The doctors had told him he was lucky. The physical therapists had been encouraging. But as weeks of recovery turned into months with only minimal improvement in his fine motor skills, Thomas had made a decision. Rather than be a shadow of what he once was, he would walk away entirely. Now sitting in the quiet hall, he wondered if that decision had been made out of pride rather than necessity. He flexed his left hand, feeling the familiar pull of scar tissue, the slight resistance in the joints that had never fully healed. Not perfect, but perhaps, just perhaps, good enough for simple notes. He began to play again, hesitantly at first, then with growing confidence. A piece he had loved as a teenager, not technically difficult but full of emotion. His left hand found the chords modified slightly to accommodate his limitations. His right hand carried the melody, clear and strong. As the final notes faded away, Thomas made his decision. He pulled out his phone and Victoria Wu's business card and began to dial. The grand hotel ballroom sparkled with crystal chandeliers and polished marble floors. Men in tuxedos and women in elegant gowns milled about, champagne glasses in hand, their jewelry catching the light as they moved. Thomas stood in a service hallway just outside, peering through a crack in the door at the gathering crowd. His borrowed suit felt stiff and slightly too tight across the shoulders. "You look like you're about to face a firing squad," David, Victoria's assistant, said as he approached with a glass of water. "Drink this. You look like you need it." Thomas accepted the glass gratefully, his throat suddenly dry. "There are a lot of people out there. 250 of the city's wealthiest arts patrons," David confirmed cheerfully. Each one paid $500 for a plate of mediocre chicken and the chance to feel cultured for an evening. Despite his nerves, Thomas smiled. David had been unexpectedly kind since his arrival an hour ago, helping him settle in and treating him like a valued guest rather than a last-minute replacement. "The piano is tuned and ready," David continued. "I had them roll out the Bösendorfer rather than the Yamaha. Victoria thought you might prefer it." Thomas nodded, touched by the consideration. The Bösendorfer had a warmer tone that would better hide any imperfections in his playing. Victoria had clearly given thought to setting him up for success. 5 minutes, a staff member called out as she hurried past with a tray of appetizers. Thomas's heart hammered against his ribs. 5 minutes until he would sit down at a piano in front of an audience for the first time in over 5 years. He had practiced late into the night after calling Victoria, running through the simple pieces he had selected: a Chopin nocturne, a Bach prelude, and the piece he had played at the community hall. Nothing too technically demanding, but all beautiful and expressive. His left hand trembled slightly and he clenched it into a fist. The familiar doubts crept in. What if he froze? What if his fingers wouldn't cooperate? What if everyone heard the limitations in his playing and pitied him? "There you are." Victoria appeared beside them, elegant in a black dress with her hair swept up. "Almost time. How are you feeling?" "Terrified," Thomas admitted. Victoria smiled. "Good. The day you stop feeling nervous before a performance is the day you should quit. It means you no longer care enough." She looked him over, straightening his tie slightly. "Remember, this is just background music for the cocktail hour. Most people won't even be paying close attention. Think of it as a warm-up, a way to get comfortable performing again." Thomas nodded, though they both knew this was more than just background music for him. It was a test of his courage, his ability, his willingness to move forward rather than stay trapped in the past. "Ready?" Victoria asked. No, Thomas thought, but he nodded anyway. David pushed the door open wider, and Thomas followed Victoria into the ballroom. Heads turned as they passed, guests recognizing the artistic director and wondering about the man with her. Thomas kept his eyes fixed on the gleaming black piano that waited on a small raised platform at one end of the room. Victoria stepped onto the platform and tapped a microphone that had been set up beside the piano. The gentle feedback drew everyone's attention, and conversations quieted. "Good evening, and thank you all for coming tonight to support music education in our city's schools," she began. "While you enjoy your cocktails, we have a special treat. Joining us this evening is a remarkable pianist, Thomas Lee." Thomas climbed the 2 steps to the platform, acutely aware of all eyes on him. Victoria continued, "Thomas will provide some beautiful music as we begin our evening of celebration and generosity." She stepped aside, leaving Thomas alone in the spotlight. He sat down at the piano, adjusting the bench out of habit. The ballroom was silent now, the crowd waiting expectantly. Thomas placed his hands on the keys and took a deep breath. "Start simple," he told himself, just like at the community hall. He began with the Bach prelude, a piece he had played countless times as a student. The notes flowed from his fingers, clean and precise. His left hand cooperated better than he had dared hope, finding the harmonies with only occasional hesitation. As he played, the tension in his shoulders began to ease. The piece ended, and there was polite applause. Some guests had already turned back to their conversations, just as Victoria had predicted. This was, after all, just background music for most of them. Thomas moved on to the Chopin Nocturne, a more emotional piece that required greater expressiveness. As he played, he found himself getting lost in the music, forgetting about his damaged hand, about the crowd, about the 5 years he had spent running away from this very thing. There was only the melody, the harmonies, the way the music rose and fell like breathing. When the nocturne ended, the applause was warmer, more engaged. Thomas noticed that more people had turned to watch him. Conversations paused with wine glasses halfway to lips. He had planned to play the simple piece from the community hall next, but something made him hesitate. He was connecting with the audience now, drawing them in. The simple piece might not maintain that connection. Without fully deciding to do so, Thomas began to play something else entirely. The third movement of a Beethoven sonata he had once performed at competitions. It was far more technically challenging than anything he had practiced for tonight, with runs and trills that would test even a pianist with two fully functional hands. His left hand protested at first, the damaged fingers struggling to keep up with the demands of the piece. A wrong note here, a slight fumble there. But rather than stopping or slowing down, Thomas adjusted on the fly, modifying the difficult passages to work within his limitations while maintaining the spirit of the music. And then something remarkable happened. As he reached the heart of the movement, the part where Beethoven poured raw emotion into every note, Thomas forgot about his damaged hand entirely. He wasn't thinking about what he couldn't do. He was focused only on what the music needed from him. His fingers found ways to create the sounds he wanted, working around obstacles with an ingenuity born of necessity. The music soared through the ballroom, commanding attention. Every conversation had stopped now. Waiters stood still, trays in hand. Victoria, watching from the side of the room, pressed a hand to her mouth, eyes wide with surprise and delight. When Thomas struck the final chord, the silence that followed seemed to vibrate with energy. Then came the applause, not polite or obligatory, but enthusiastic, genuine. People were standing, clapping with real appreciation. Thomas remained seated at the piano, slightly dazed. Had he really just played Beethoven in front of hundreds of people? Had it actually gone well? Victoria hurried to the platform, beaming. "That was magnificent," she whispered as she leaned down beside him. "You never mentioned you were going to play Beethoven." "I didn't know I was," Thomas admitted, still breathless from the effort and emotion. Victoria turned to the microphone. "Ladies and gentlemen, Thomas Lee, thank you for that beautiful performance. Dinner will be served in the main dining room in 15 minutes. As guests began to move toward the dining area, many stopped by the piano to offer compliments. Thomas accepted them in a daze, still processing what had just happened. He had played in public again, really played not just simple notes but challenging, meaningful music. And while it wasn't perfect, it was honest and true. The realization brought a lump to his throat. Once the crowd had thinned, David appeared with another glass of water. "That was unexpected," he said with a grin. "Victoria looks like she just won the lottery." Thomas sipped the water, suddenly aware of how exhausted he felt. Playing with such intensity after so long had drained him completely. "Is there somewhere I can rest for a few minutes?" he asked. David nodded. "There's a small green room just down the hall. Follow me." Thomas stood on shaky legs and followed David through a side door and down a corridor to a small, comfortable room with a sofa and a few armchairs. "Take your time," David said. "Dinner will go on for at least an hour before Victoria gives her speech about the fundraising goals." Left alone, Thomas sank onto the sofa and closed his eyes. His left hand ached, but it was a good ache, like muscles after long-neglected exercise. He flexed his fingers, feeling the familiar pull of scar tissue but also a new suppleness that hadn't been there before. A soft knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. "Come in," he called, expecting David or Victoria. Instead, an older man with silver hair and kind eyes stepped into the room. He walked with a slight limp and carried a glass of scotch. "Mr. Lee," he said, his voice warm and cultured. "I hope I'm not intruding. My name is Robert Phillips. I was hoping to have a word with you about your performance." Thomas stood, automatically extending his hand. "Of course, Mr. Phillips, please, sit down." As the man settled into an armchair, Thomas noticed the way he held himself, with the careful posture of someone managing chronic pain. "Your Beethoven was quite moving," Phillips said, "especially considering the circumstances." Thomas tilted his head. "The circumstances?" Phillips gestured toward Thomas's left hand. "Victoria mentioned your accident. I know something about playing through limitations myself. I was once a cellist with the London Philharmonic, until arthritis made that impossible." "I'm sorry," Thomas said, genuinely moved by the man's story. Phillips waved away the sympathy. "Don't be. I found other ways to stay connected to music, which is actually why I wanted to speak with you." He leaned forward, his eyes bright with purpose. "Mr. Lee, I run a small music therapy program at the Children's Hospital. We work with young patients dealing with injuries, chronic conditions, and lengthy recoveries. What I heard tonight, your ability to adapt, to find new ways to express the music despite physical limitations. That's exactly what our children need to see. Thomas stared at Robert Phillips, trying to process what the man was suggesting. You want me to work with children? To inspire them, Robert clarified, taking a sip of his scotch. Many of our kids are dealing with injuries or conditions that have taken away activities they love. Sports, art, music, the things that gave their lives meaning. They need to see someone who has found a way forward. Thomas shook his head. Mr. Phillips, I just played piano in public for the first time in 5 years. I'm hardly an inspirational success story, aren't you? Robert asked, his eyebrows rising. From where I was sitting, I saw a man who refused to let physical limitations define what he could accomplish. That sounds like exactly the kind of story our children need to hear. Before Thomas could respond, the door opened, and Victoria entered, her face flushed with excitement. Thomas, there you are. Everyone is asking about you. The chairman of the board wants to meet you and... She stopped, noticing Robert. Oh, Robert, I see you found our pianist. Indeed I have, Robert said with a smile. I was just telling Mr. Lee about our program at the Children's Hospital. Victoria's eyes lit up. What a wonderful idea. Thomas would be perfect for that. Thomas felt a flash of irritation. Everyone seemed to be making plans for him without consulting him first. Just like at the community hall, he was being pushed into situations he wasn't sure he was ready for. I haven't agreed to anything, he said firmly. I came here tonight to play background music at a fundraiser, that's all. Victoria and Robert exchanged looks. Of course, Robert said gently. I'm simply extending an invitation. No pressure. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a business card, much as Victoria had done the night before. Think about it. Visit us sometime. See what we're doing before you decide. Thomas took the card reluctantly, tucking it into his pocket alongside Victoria's. I'll think about it, he said, knowing even as he spoke that he probably wouldn't. One night of playing didn't mean he was ready to become some kind of inspirational figure. He was still figuring things out for himself. Victoria seemed to sense his unease. Why don't we head back to the ballroom? Dinner should be wrapping up soon, and I'd like to introduce you to a few people. Thomas followed her back to the main event, where waiters were clearing the remains of the meal. Victoria led him from table to table, introducing him to donors and board members. Everyone was complimentary about his playing, though Thomas suspected many of them were simply being polite. One woman, however, approached him with genuine enthusiasm. She was older, perhaps in her 70s, with bright eyes and an elegant silver bob. Mr. Lee, she said, taking his hand in both of hers, your Beethoven moved me to tears. I'm Lydia Thompson, retired professor of music from the university. Thomas recognized the name immediately. Lydia Thompson was a legend in classical music circles, known for her exacting standards and brutally honest critiques. Professor Thompson, he said, genuinely honored. Thank you for your kind words. They're not kind, they're accurate, she corrected him with a small smile. You played with such emotion, such heart. Technical perfection is common enough, but what you brought to that piece was something far rarer. Thomas felt a warmth spread through his chest at her words. Coming from someone like Lydia Thompson, this wasn't empty flattery. Your left hand, she continued, glancing down at it. May I? Surprised, Thomas extended his hand. Lydia examined it with a professional eye, noting the scars and the slight misalignment of his fingers. Remarkable, she murmured. The adaptations you've made to your fingering are quite inventive. You've created new pathways where the old ones were blocked. Thomas had never thought of it that way. It was instinct more than planning, he admitted. I just found a way to make the sounds I wanted. Lydia nodded. That's the mark of a true musician. The instrument is merely a tool. The music comes from within. She released his hand. I would be very interested to hear more of your playing. Perhaps we could arrange something at the university? An informal recital for some of my former students who are now teaching there. Another invitation. Another opportunity he wasn't sure he was ready for. But this time, instead of immediate resistance, Thomas felt a flicker of curiosity. What would it be like to play for a small group of musicians who could truly appreciate what he was trying to do? I'll consider it, he said, and was surprised to realize he meant it. The evening continued, a blur of handshakes and conversations. By the time the event wound down near midnight, Thomas was exhausted but strangely energized. He had connected with music again tonight, and with people who understood its importance. As the ballroom emptied, Victoria found him sitting at the piano, idly pressing keys without making sound. "Successful night," she said, sitting beside him on the bench. "The donations exceeded our target by 30%. "That's wonderful," Thomas said sincerely. "The music education programs will benefit greatly." "Yes," Victoria agreed. "And so I think, have you?" Thomas looked at her, questioning. "You've been hiding, Thomas," she said gently. "Hiding your talent, your passion, your gift. Tonight you took a step back into the light." He wanted to deny it, to say he had simply done her a favor and now would return to his quiet life selling instruments rather than playing them, but he knew it would be a lie. Something had changed tonight. The music had awakened a part of him he had tried to bury. "I'm not the same pianist I was before the accident," he said quietly. "I never will be." "No," Victoria agreed. "You're not. You're something else now, something new, perhaps something more interesting." Thomas flexed his left hand, feeling the familiar tightness but also a new awareness of its capabilities. "I don't know what happens next," he admitted. Victoria smiled. "None of us ever do. But I know people who would value what you bring to music now. If you're willing to explore it." David appeared, coat in hand. "Car's ready whenever you are, Victoria." She stood, straightening her dress. "Think about what I said, Thomas, and about Robert's invitation. Sometimes the most meaningful music happens in the most unexpected places." After Victoria left, Thomas remained at the piano, lost in thought. The hotel staff worked around him, clearing tables and folding linens. No one rushed him or asked him to leave. It was as if they sensed he needed this moment. Finally, he placed his hands on the keys and began to play again. Not Beethoven or Chopin or Bach, but something new, something that came from within him, a simple melody at first, tentative and searching. His right hand led the way, strong and sure. His left hand followed, finding its own path, working within its limitations rather than fighting against them. The melody grew, becoming more complex, more confident. There was something different about his playing now, a depth that hadn't been there before, even in his pre-accident days. Back then, he had played with technical brilliance, but perhaps without true understanding. Now, having experienced loss and limitation, his music carried the weight of those experiences. A member of the cleaning staff paused her work to listen, a stack of tablecloths forgotten in her arms. Another hotel employee stopped in the doorway, drawn by the sound. Neither of them were classical music experts like Lydia Thompson, but both seemed moved by what they heard. When Thomas finally stopped playing, the silence felt rich rather than empty. The two staff members applauded softly, then continued with their work, embarrassed to have been caught listening. Thomas closed the piano lid gently and stood. It was late, well past midnight, but he felt more awake than he had in years. As he walked through the hotel lobby toward the exit, he passed a large mirror and caught a glimpse of himself. He looked different somehow, his posture straighter, his eyes brighter. Music had always been his true voice, and tonight he had found it again, though it spoke in a new dialect now. Outside, the night air was cool and crisp. Thomas turned down the valet's offer to call him a taxi, preferring to walk and clear his head. As he strolled through the quiet downtown streets, his mind kept returning to Robert's invitation. The children's hospital, kids struggling with limitations of their own. What could he possibly offer them? He wasn't a therapist or a teacher. He was just a pianist who had run away from music for 5 years because he couldn't bear to be less than what he once was. But maybe that was exactly what those children needed to hear. That imperfection didn't mean the end. That adaptation wasn't the same as giving up. That sometimes working within new limitations could lead to unexpected discoveries. By the time Thomas reached his small apartment, a plan was forming in his mind. He wouldn't commit to anything permanent yet, but he would visit the hospital, see this program of Robert's firsthand, and maybe, just maybe, he would play for the children there. Not as a master demonstrating perfection, but as a fellow traveler showing them one possible path forward. He took out his phone and Robert's business card. It was far too late to call, but he could send an email, just a simple note expressing interest in learning more. As he typed the message, Thomas felt a strange sense of rightness, as if pieces of his life that had been scattered by the accident were finally beginning to find new arrangements. Not the same as before, but perhaps just as meaningful in their own way. He sent the email and then on impulse opened the voice recorder app on his phone. Sitting at his small upright piano, a basic instrument, nothing like the grand Bösendorfer he had played tonight. Thomas began to record the melody he had improvised at the hotel. It was rough, unpolished, but there was something honest about it. Something that reflected who he was now, not who he had been before. As his fingers moved across the keys, Thomas realized he was smiling. For the first time in 5 years, he was making music without measuring it against what he had lost. Instead, he was discovering what he might still find. 6 months later, Thomas stood in the hallway of the children's hospital, listening to the sounds that filled the space. Beeping monitors, squeaking cartwheels, muted conversations between doctors, and floating above it all music, hesitant at first, then growing stronger as small hands found their confidence on piano keys. That's it. Andy, feel the rhythm, Thomas encouraged the boy seated at the keyboard. 10 years old, with a cast covering his right arm from a skateboarding accident, Andy was learning to play simple melodies with his left hand alone. His tongue stuck out slightly as he concentrated, determined to master the sequence of notes. "I messed up," Andy said, stopping abruptly when he hit a wrong note. "So what?" Thomas replied with a smile. "Music isn't about perfection. It's about expression. Try again, but this time don't stop when you make a mistake. Just keep going." Andy nodded and began again. This time, when he hit the wrong note, he kept playing, a look of surprise crossing his face when he realized the mistake didn't ruin everything. "See?" Thomas said when Andy finished. "The music continues. One wrong note isn't the end of the world." It was a lesson Thomas himself had been learning over these past months. After his performance at the gala, he had visited Robert's music therapy program as promised. What was meant to be a single visit had turned into a regular commitment. Once a week at first, then twice, and now Thomas spent 3 mornings each week working with children who, like him, were learning to adapt to new limitations. The transformation hadn't happened overnight. There had been moments of doubt, days when Thomas questioned whether he had anything valuable to offer these kids. But slowly, as he watched them respond to music, their faces lighting up when they created something beautiful despite their challenges, he had found a sense of purpose he'd never expected. "Thomas, do you have a minute?" Robert appeared in the doorway of the music room, his kind eyes crinkled with what looked like excitement. "Of course," Thomas replied. "Andy, practice that section until I get back, okay? Remember, no stopping even if you hit a wrong note." The boy nodded, already focused again on the keyboard. Thomas followed Robert into the hallway, curious about the older man's barely contained enthusiasm. "I just got off the phone with Victoria Wu," Robert said. "The Symphony's educational outreach program wants to feature our kids in their spring showcase." Thomas raised his eyebrows. "That's wonderful. The kids would love performing in a real concert hall." "There's more," Robert continued. "They want you to play with them. A collaborative piece, you and 5 of our young musicians." Thomas felt a flutter of both excitement and apprehension. He had performed a few times since the gala, small recitals at the university as Lydia had suggested, and once as a last-minute substitute for the symphony's regular pianist in a chamber music piece. Each performance had gotten easier, more comfortable, but playing alongside the children on a stage that big with all eyes on them, the kids would be so thrilled, Robert added, seeing Thomas's hesitation. "You've become something of a hero to them, you know." Thomas shook his head, still uncomfortable with that idea. "I'm just someone who's a little further along the same path they're on." "Exactly," Robert said. "And that's why they need to see you up on that stage, to know what's possible." Back in the music room, Andy had been joined by Lily, a 13-year-old girl with a rare nerve condition that had weakened her hands. She was showing Andy a trick Thomas had taught her for handling a difficult transition between notes. Watching them, Thomas felt a surge of pride. These kids, facing challenges most adults would find overwhelming, showed up each day with courage and determination. They didn't give up when things got hard. They adapted. They found new ways forward. How could he do any less? "All right," Thomas told Robert. "I'm in. But I want the kids involved in arranging the piece. Their input, their ideas, not just playing notes someone else wrote for them." Robert beamed. "I wouldn't have it any other way." The weeks leading up to the showcase flew by in a blur of rehearsals, arrangements, and nervous excitement. Thomas worked closely with the 5 children who had been selected to perform. Andy with his healing arm, Lily with her delicate hands, Luis, who played from his wheelchair, Rachel, who was losing her vision but whose sense of pitch was perfect, and Gabriel, who had lost part of his left leg but had discovered a talent for percussion, played seated. Together, they created something unique, a piece that highlighted each child's strengths while working around their limitations. Thomas's role was to support them, his piano part weaving through their contributions, sometimes leading, sometimes following. On the day of the performance, Thomas found himself pacing backstage at the concert hall, more nervous than he had been for any of his solo performances. Victoria appeared, elegant as always in a concert black dress. "Quite a different scene from the last time you were here," she observed. The last time had been 3 months ago, when Thomas had filled in for the symphony's regular pianist. His first time back on the main stage since his accident. "The stakes feel higher this time," Thomas admitted. Victoria nodded toward the children, who were gathered in a circle, going through last-minute preparations. "Because it's not about you anymore," she said softly. "It's about them." She was right, Thomas realized. This performance wasn't about proving his own worth or reclaiming his former glory. It was about showing these kids and the audience that limitations didn't define what was possible. 5 minutes to places, a stagehand called. Thomas gathered the children for a final pep talk. "Remember what we've practiced," he told them. "Listen to each other. Support each other.
And if something unexpected happens, the music continues," they chorused, repeating the mantra Thomas had instilled in them. He smiled.
"Exactly. Now let's go make some music." As they took their places on stage, Thomas caught sight of familiar faces in the audience. Mrs. Chen in the front row, beaming with pride. Lydia Thompson a few seats over, her critical eye already assessing the setup. Robert and his staff from the hospital, David from the symphony office, and many of the donors from that fateful gala 6 months ago. The house lights dimmed, and Thomas nodded to the children. They began to play, each contributing their part to the whole. The piece started simply. A gentle melody passed from one young musician to another. Thomas's piano provided the foundation, steady and supportive. As the music built, Thomas watched the children's faces. Every one of them was completely present in the moment, focused on creating something beautiful together. When Andy fumbled a note, he kept going without missing a beat, throwing Thomas a quick smile. When Lily needed a moment to reposition her hands, Luis extended his part slightly to cover the transition. They had prepared for these moments in rehearsal, building flexibility into the piece to accommodate each person's needs. What might have seemed like mistakes to an untrained ear were actually part of the organic nature of the performance, a true reflection of the musicians themselves. As they reached the final movement, Thomas's part became more prominent. This was the moment when he would demonstrate what he had learned alongside these children, that adaptation wasn't surrender, that finding new ways to create beauty wasn't settling for less. His hands moved across the keyboard, his left hand no longer hidden or protected, but contributing fully within its capabilities. The music he created wasn't perfect by classical standards, but it was honest and alive and uniquely his own. When the final notes faded away, there was a moment of complete silence. Then the audience rose to their feet as one, applause thundering through the concert hall. Thomas stood and motioned for the children to stand as well, making sure they received the recognition they deserved. As they took their bows, Thomas saw tears on many faces in the audience. Not tears of pity, but of genuine emotion, of connection with what these young musicians had shared. Backstage after the performance, surrounded by excited children and proud parents, Thomas felt a tap on his shoulder. He turned to find Victoria with an elegant older man he didn't recognize. "Thomas, this is Harold Kim, director of the National Conservatory's new adaptive music program," Victoria said. "He's very interested in the work you've been doing here." Harold extended his hand. "Mr. Lee, that was extraordinary. We're developing a program specifically for musicians with physical limitations, and we need someone who understands both the challenges and the possibilities, someone who can teach from experience." Thomas shook the man's hand, surprised. "I'm not a teacher," he said automatically. Harold gestured toward the children who were excitedly recounting the performance to their families. "Evidence suggests otherwise," he said with a smile. Before Thomas could respond, Mrs. Chen appeared at his side. "My former student now collecting job offers from the National Conservatory," she said proudly. I always knew you would find your way. Thanks to you, Thomas replied. If you hadn't tricked me into playing at that community fundraiser. Mrs. Chen waved away his words. I opened a door. You chose to walk through it. As the evening wound down, Thomas found himself alone on the stage again, sitting at the piano in the now empty concert hall. So much had changed in just 6 months. He had gone from hiding his damaged hand to showcasing what it could still do. From selling instruments to creating music again. From isolation to connection. He placed his hands on the keys, both hands equally important now though differently capable, and began to play. Not a piece from the classical repertoire this time, but the composition he had begun the night of the gala, the one he had recorded on his phone. Over the months it had grown and evolved, just as he had. As the music filled the empty hall, Thomas thought about the path that had led him here. The accident that had seemed like an ending had actually been a beginning. The limitation that had appeared to be a wall had become a door. His fingers moved across the keys, finding their way through the melody. His left hand would never have the same dexterity it once had, but it had found new strength, new purpose. Just as he had. When he finished playing, Thomas didn't immediately rise. He sat for a moment, hands resting lightly on the keys, and thought about what came next. The offer from the National Conservatory was tempting. The chance to help shape a program for musicians like himself and the children he had worked with, to create institutional change that could benefit many. But whatever he decided, he knew one thing for certain: he would keep playing, keep adapting, keep finding new ways to create beauty in an imperfect world. The journey that had begun with just a few simple notes had become a symphony of possibility. And Thomas Lee, once a pianist defined by what he had lost, was now defined by what he had found. A new voice, a new purpose, and the courage to share both with the world.